The reason why is to win a war, you have to solve 3 problems, okay? Okay. The first problem is clear strategy, okay? What are you trying to accomplish in this country? What are your clear military objectives, okay? Second is you must adapt to the battlefield, okay? Because all your best plans will change over the course of the battle, okay? So the adversary that is most willing to adapt to the battlefield will win, okay? And the third thing is the will to fight. So if you want to look at a war and who's most likely to win the war, you ask these 3 questions. 1, does this guy have clear military objectives that everyone understands? Because that will determine strategy, okay? Second is this guy adapting to the battlefield? And the third is this guy, does this guy still have the will to fight? If the answer is yes to all 3 questions, then the person will most likely win the war. Okay, and if you look at the Vietnam War, even though America was killing a lot of people, it killed 3 million Vietnamese during the course of the war. It was not destroying the enemy's will to fight. In fact, it was making them angrier. And therefore, more people were willing to fight the Americans. Okay? So very early on, the American political leadership knew the war could not be won. So then the question then is, why did America stay in the war? And the answer is credibility. Okay? Credibility just means they didn't want to lose face. They didn't want to be laughed at by the Chinese and by the Soviets and by the Europeans, okay? But there's actually another way to understand credibility, and it's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. Okay? Have you guys heard of the sunk cost fallacy? And the idea is never ever go into a casino. The reason why is that when you go to a casino and you start losing money, at some point you cannot leave the casino. Why not?
You feel like you've lost so much, so now you have to make it back.
Exactly. You want to reclaim the money you've lost, okay? You've invested so much that you cannot leave. You have to get that money back. And that's a problem with war. Eventually, you've invested so much, you cannot leave the war. And that's what happened in Vietnam. America invested so much, it didn't want to leave the war because it did not want to admit that all this has been lost. Okay? It's what we call the sunk cost fallacy. And that's why, even though America could not win the war, it still wanted to fight the war. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So the Vietnam War is another example, okay, that is similar to this, where America invests enough soldiers that it refuses to leave the war and admit defeat, okay? Does that make sense, guys? All right. Now, let's look at one more example. And this is the most recent example, and it's the Russian-Ukraine war. Now, as you know, in February 2022, Putin ordered a special military operation against Ukraine. Okay? And this is Ukraine. And Russia attacked from 3 axes. Okay? The north to take Kiev, the capital. You have the east to take Donetsk. And then you have the south from Crimea to take the south. Okay? And as we know, the north failed. Okay? The north attack failed, and the Russians had to turn back. But the east and the south were successful, okay? Now, let's think about this. You have an extremely powerful military attacking your country, the Ukraine. If you were the Ukrainian president, if you were the Ukrainian military, there's really only one way you can fight this war and win. And what is it? Using traditional military doctrine. How must you fight this war? You guys know? Let's go back to mass forces, avoid encirclement, protect supply lines. How must you fight this war? There's only one way you can fight this war. Excuse me? How do you disrupt supply lines? There's only one way you can fight this war and win. And what is it? The enemy is attacking you, right? So what must you do? Okay, the answer is you must retreat. Okay? Why? The enemy is attacking, right? So you pull back your forces. Why would you do that? What's the logic of that?
Because then they have longer supply lines.
Exactly, okay? It's that simple, okay? You want to overextend your enemy. Ukraine is a huge country, right? And Russia didn't send out that many soldiers, maybe 160,000. That's not that many soldiers. So if you just give them space, they're going to outrun the supply lines, okay? And then when they outrun their supply lines, you can encircle them and you can disrupt their supply. And that's the only way you can win the war, okay? What did the Ukrainians do instead? That's the only way to win this war. But what did the Ukrainians do instead, which made them lose the war? Yeah. So the Ukrainians refused to give up space, okay? They refused to give up land. They want to fight the Russians for every inch of territory. And eventually, because the Russians had more forces, mass forces, they were able to push through, okay? So that's the first major mistake that Ukraine made. But then last summer, Ukraine launched something called a counteroffensive, right? So once Russia was able to take space, because Russia is a land army, it started to develop fortifications, defenses, okay? Mainly artillery. And that 3 lines of defenses. And in the summer offensive, the Ukrainian military, for whatever reason, sent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers against this artillery, and the Russians blew everyone up, okay? Now, here's a question. Why are the Ukrainians doing this? They've lost the war now, right? They have no more soldiers. Right now, the average age of the Ukrainian army is over 40 years old. They have guys in their 60s and 70s fighting in the military. They don't have enough manpower. The war is lost. Why would the Ukrainians do this? First of all, why would they fight for every inch of territory? And why would they launch a counteroffensive against a superior enemy? What's the problem? Okay, the first is their president, Zelensky, the guy's a TV actor, okay? Which means that he doesn't think strategy, he just thinks what looks good on TV. So for the first 2 years of the war, we're watching this on TV, right? And it looked as though the Ukrainians were going to win this war, right? I remember like 2 years ago, people were saying that the Ukrainians are going to march to Moscow and overthrow Putin. People were saying that, okay? And the reason why is that Zelensky is a master of public image manipulation, okay? He was distorting reality for people through television. The problem with that, though, is it's not reality, guys, okay? The reality on the ground is very different from TV, okay? So who else is like Zelensky in this world? Trump is exactly like Zelensky, okay? Do you understand? Trump is also concerned about what looks good on TV. He's like, I must look strong. We must look as though we're winning this war. He doesn't really care about strategy, okay? So because of this, it's very likely that he orders a land invasion of Iran because it would look good on TV, okay? So the problem with Zelensky is he cared about what looked good as opposed to actually what actually worked, okay? But you also have other problems, like you have extremists in the Ukrainian military, okay? And guys, these extremists, they're Nazis, they're neo-Nazis. And so the traditional understanding of Nazis are people who kill Jews, okay? But the Russians don't understand Nazis that way because remember, Germany and the Soviet Union fought fought this war. So the Russians understood Nazis to be enemies of Russia who want to kill Russians. And there were many neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They hate Russia. They want to kill as many Russians as possible. Okay? And they're the ones who are pushing for as much war as possible. Okay? So you have these extremists in the Ukrainian military. Okay? The last reason is NATO. So it's an open secret that NATO is helping the Ukrainian military against Russia. You have NATO military advisors devising strategy against Russia. Okay, so it's most likely that the summer offensive last summer was a NATO plan and not a Ukrainian plan. It's possible. We also know that NATO special forces are in the country directing missile strikes against Russian forces. Okay? Which means what? If this is true, and if Ukraine loses the war, meaning that it doesn't have enough soldiers to continue to fight this war, what will NATO do? Yeah. I mean, according to what happened to Vietnam War and the Athenian expedition against Sicily, it is most likely that the most likely outcome will be that NATO sends its own troops against Russia. Okay, so Macron of France have said that we want to send French soldiers, and the British Prime Minister has said that he is considering conscription for British people. Okay, which means that young British citizens will be drafted into the army to fight Russia. All right, so these are three historical examples that are very similar to what could happen in Iran. Okay, does that make sense, guys? All right, any questions before I continue? All right, is this clear so far? All right, now let's use another mode of analysis called game theory analysis, okay? And this is what I've been teaching you this semester. And the idea is that society, what happens in the real world, is a game among human beings. Okay, and each person is trying to play this game as to optimize the outcome for that person. Okay, so the question then is, why would the United States send 100,000 troops into Iran? So let's look at the individual motivations of the individual players, okay? So you have the United States. What does the United States want to do? What does it want to do? By doing what? And accomplishing what? It wants to topple the regime in Tehran, right? And you can only do that through a ground invasion, okay? So the United States is trying to topple Iran. But then you also have other actors, okay? So Iran. What does Iran want to do? What does Iran want to do? Or basically the Revolutionary Guard Corps. What do they want to do? See? They want to kill as many Americans as possible, okay? Do you understand? They want to force an American land invasion, okay? So Iran wants to force a U.S. invasion, knowing that if the U.S. invades, it has to lose the war, okay? It will lose the war because the Revolutionary Guard can just send suicide bombers against the United States, okay? Now let's look at Israel. Okay? We know that the United States wants to topple Iran. We know that Iran wants to force a U.S. invasion to defeat the Americans, to humiliate the Americans, and exact revenge for what happened in the past. Okay? What does Israel want to do? What is Israel's optimal outcome? Do you guys know? If you're Israel, what do you want to happen? Okay, so you want Iran defeated, okay? And then what do you want to happen? You want Iran defeated, you want the proxies defeated, and then what do you want to happen? Do you want the United States to stay in the Middle East? What happens if the United States and Iran both lose the war? I mean, Iran is destroyed as a country, the United States is destroyed as a military presence in the Middle East. What would happen? Israel becomes the top dog in the Middle East. Do you understand? Okay? Israel can now control the entire Middle East. So the ultimate outcome for Israel is Iran and the United States are both destroyed. Okay? Do you understand? How about Saudi Arabia? What is their optimal outcome? Exactly the same as Israel. Exactly. Okay? Do you understand? Okay? Which will leave the Middle East to Saudi Arabia and Israel, but Israel is a far superior military than Saudi Arabia. Okay? Remember, it's very easy to blow up Saudi Arabia. They have oil fields. Okay? Not that easy to blow up Israel. So Israel becomes a top dog. You understand game theory? In other words, all the major participants want an invasion of Iran. Okay? But they want different outcomes. And Saudi Arabia and Israel most benefit if this situation happens, where you have 100,000 US troops in the country and they can't get out, okay? Because it becomes sunk cost fallacy. The United States can only pour in more soldiers. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So is this clear to you guys? Okay? You can either use historical analysis to get to this outcome, but you can also use game theory to get to this outcome. Any questions so far? Okay, great, okay. So Celine asked the most pivotal question, okay? The United States has nuclear weapons, which is its ultimate trump card, right? So what Trump can say to Tehran is like, I have 100,000 troops in the country. You have to let them go, or I will nuke you, okay? Do you understand? Trump can say that. Listen, I'm Trump. I'm Donald Trump. I need to look strong. I have 100,000 troops in the country. I can't get them out of the country. So he says to Tehran, you either let them go, okay? You either guarantee him safe passage out of the country, or I will nuke you. Right? So that's what will happen. That is what Donald Trump will do. Once the situation arises, the only way for Donald Trump to save face is to threaten Tehran and says, you either let my guys go, or I will nuke the entire country. Right? So, how does Tehran get out of this situation? How do the Iranians protect themselves against this possibility? Because you're absolutely right. This is exactly what will happen if this situation will arise. Trump will respond with nuclear weapons, or the threat of nuclear weapons. So what must the Iranians do to protect themselves against this possibility? Who can help the Iranians now? Russia. Okay, do you understand? So before this war happens, Iran and Russia must come to an agreement where Putin says from the onset, no one is allowed to use nuclear weapons. Okay? If Iran uses nuclear weapons, I will nuke Iran. If the United States uses nuclear weapons, I will nuke the United States. If Israel uses nuclear weapons, I will nuke Israel. Okay? If Putin says that, how will the world react? If Putin says this, you are not allowed to use nuclear weapons, how will the world react? He's a hero, right? He saved humanity. But because he says this, the United States is now trapped. Okay? You understand? And so this becomes a black hole for the United States, where they can only send in more troops. They can't get any troops out. They can only send in more troops. What's the problem with this? What's the problem with sending in more troops? No, there's actually a huge problem with this idea of sending in more troops. What is it? Okay, you can't, like, no one wants to go fight, you understand? The military cannot recruit soldiers, all right? But even if you did have enough troops, as Jack says, you can't resupply them. Why? Why can't you actually resupply your army? Why not? But there's a bigger problem than the supply lines. What is it? What do you need to create bullets and ammunition? America has no manufacturing capacity because America moved all its manufacturing capacity to China. Okay? Remember this. So for every one ship that America can build, China can build 232 ships. That's what the Pentagon says. Okay, do you understand? So if this war were to happen, there's absolutely no way America can win this war. It's just completely trapped inside Iran. And once it becomes trapped, some cost fallacy comes into play, and America just puts in all of its resources into the country, but it's a black hole. Okay? It cannot use nuclear weapons because Putin has said from the onset, you are not allowed to use nuclear weapons. All right? But now the question then is, why would Putin do that? Right? Why would Putin involve himself in this war? And that's what we'll discuss next class. All right? How Putin sees this war and how Putin will react in this war. Okay? But before we end, are there any questions about any of this? Does this make sense to you guys? Is this clear? Any questions?
Like, is it possible for the United States to make Iran to Iraq? Like, have they sent an army to?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So the problem with Iraq is that Iraq is an independent country. Do you understand? There are 10,000 American soldiers in Iraq. So you would need their permission. Even if you had their permission, there's a problem here because there are lots of Shia militiamen in Iraq who are loyal to Iran. Okay, and they would see the American invasion force as an opportunity to attack the Americans. Okay, because they're still angry about the Americans for what happened in Iraq. But even if they could have a staging area in Iraq, they still have to deal with mountains. Okay, do you understand? All right. I mean, the problem is you have 100,000 troops in the country. You have to get out of the country. Okay, and it's very hard to get them out of the country. If you go through the mountains, you're going to get an ambush in the mountains. If you go through the air, those drones are going to strike you down.